You're sitting in a coffee shop trying to read. Someone 2 tables over is tapping a pen against the edge of their notebook. The ventilation hum is pulsing at an uneven rhythm that shifts every few seconds. The barista is scraping foam off a pitcher in sharp metallic bursts that cut through the ambient noise. Your friend across from you is talking, but you've lost the thread entirely because your brain is processing all of it at once. You assume this is a focus problem, a discipline issue, something you could fix if you just tried harder. That assumption is wrong. And the reason has nothing to do with willpower or self-control. It has to do with something called latent inhibition, a neurological filtering mechanism that determines what your brain decides to ignore. Latent inhibition is your brain's ability to tune out stimuli it has already labeled as irrelevant to your survival or goals. Most people have high latent inhibition, which means their brains filter out the pen tapping, the hum, and the scraping automatically. But roughly 7% of the population has measurably low latent inhibition, meaning their brains do not pre-filter environmental stimuli. They process everything in the environment as if it's new, every single time they encounter it. And that difference is not a bug or a deficit. It's a structural feature with evolutionary, creative, and psychiatric consequences most people have never heard of. Here's how latent inhibition actually works at the neurological level. When you encounter a stimulus, your brain runs a quick relevance check through your prefrontal cortex and hippocampus. Is this thing important right now? And does it require a behavioral response? If the answer is no, and it stays no over repeated exposures, your brain stops fully processing it and relegates it to background noise. This happens without conscious input or deliberate decision-making on your part. You don't actively decide to ignore the hum of your refrigerator The refrigerator hum keeps getting processed with the same level of attention as it did the first time. The pen tapping keeps triggering the same novelty response it did when it started. Every detail stays loud, and nothing ever truly fades into the background. Now here's the first layer that changes everything about how we understand attention and creativity. Low latent inhibition doesn't just mean you notice more sensory details in your environment. It means your brain is constantly forming new associations between things that high latent inhibition brains have already written off as unrelated. A study published in 2003 by researchers at Harvard and the University of Toronto found that people with low latent inhibition scored significantly higher on tests of creative ideation. Specifically, they excelled at remote association tasks, which are problems where you have to connect two ideas that don't obviously belong together. The pen tapping might remind you of Morse code, which makes you think of naval communication during wartime. Naval communication makes you remember a documentary about World War II cryptography you watched last month. And suddenly you have an idea for a story about a spy who hides messages in ambient sound that no one else is paying attention to. That chain of associations doesn't happen for most people, not because they're less intelligent or less imaginative, but because their brains stopped paying attention at the pen tapping stage and moved on to something deemed more relevant. Low latent inhibition keeps the pen in play as a viable source of meaningful information. It keeps everything in play, all the time, without sorting for importance. So why doesn't everyone have this trait if it leads to creative breakthroughs and novel insights? Because there's a cost, and it's a steep one that affects daily functioning. Low latent inhibition is cognitively expensive in terms of the mental resources it demands every single moment. Your working memo. You're holding the pen's sound, the hum, the scraping, your friend's words, the title of the book in front of you, the smell of coffee, and the flicker of movement near the window all at once. Something has to give, and usually it's the thing you were actually trying to focus on. And this is where the second mechanism enters, the one that determines whether low latent inhibition becomes a superpower or a liability. Low latent inhibition, on its own, is just undifferentiated noise flooding your conscious awareness. What determines whether that noise becomes creativity or chaos is a second variable called working memory capacity. If you have low latent inhibition and high working memory, you can hold all that incoming information and actually do something constructive with it. You can sift through the noise, identify meaningful patterns, and discard what's genuinely irrelevant. You can connect disparate ideas in ways that lead to original insights or creative work. That combination is disproportionately common in artists, writers, inventors, and scientists who produce recognized original contributions. A study published in 2010 in the journal Personality and Individual Differences found that eminent creative achievers were 7 times more likely to have low latent inhibition than the general population. But here's the catch that nobody talks about when they romanticize the creative mind. If you have low latent inhibition and low working memory, you can't sift, organize, or prioritize the incoming flood. You just drown in it, unable to separate signal from noise. And that combination is strongly associated with psychotic spectrum disorders, particularly schizophrenia. A landmark study published in 1996 by Baruch, Hemsley, and Gray showed that acute schizophrenic patients demonstrated significantly impaired latent inhibition compared to healthy controls. Their brains couldn't stop processing irrelevant stimuli, and everything in the environment demanded equal attention. In 2008, researchers at Harvard Medical School ran a study on undergraduate students who tested positive for low latent inhibition. They gave them a creative achievement questionnaire and a standardized working memory test to measure cognitive capacity. The students with low latent inhibition and high working memory had published poetry, won art competitions, filed patents, and composed music at rates far above their peers. The students with low latent inhibition and low working memory reported higher rates of intrusive thoughts, anxiety, and referential thinking. One participant described walking through a grocery store and feeling like every product placement was a coded instruction meant specifically for them. Same underlying mechanism, same neurological trait, completely different outcome. Entirely dependent on whether the brain had the capacity to manage the flood of unfiltered information. But here's the part that should genuinely alarm you if you recognize yourself in this description. You can move between those two states, and the transition can happen faster than you think. Working memory capacity isn't fixed across time or circumstances. Sleep deprivation tanks it with measurable, reproducible effects. A single night of 4 hours of sleep can reduce functional working memory by nearly 20% according to research published in Sleep Medicine Reviews. Chronic stress does the same thing through elevated cortisol, which impairs prefrontal cortex function over time. So does prolonged substance use, particularly alcohol and cannabis, which interfere with executive function and working memory consolidation. If you have low latent inhibition and you're sleep deprived for a week, you're not just tired or a little foggy. You're operating with the cognitive profile of someone at clinical risk for a psychotic break. The stimuli don't stop flooding in, but your ability to organize them collapses. This is why so many creative people report that their best idea is to protect your working memory capacity, because that's the variable you can actually control. That means sleep, consistent and boring and non-negotiable, 7 to 9 hours every night. It means reducing cognitive load during high-stimuli environments by controlling what you can control in your surroundings. Noise-canceling headphones are not a luxury or an indulgence in this context. They're a structural intervention that prevents cognitive overload before it starts. It means being very careful with substances that interfere with executive function, especially if you're already noticing intrusive or referential thinking creeping in. And it means understanding that your distractibility is not a character flaw or a failure of discipline. It's a trade-off, a cognitive style that comes with both advantages and vulnerabilities. You're built to see connections other people miss, to notice patterns in the noise that lead to genuine insights. But that same wiring makes you vulnerable to overload when your capacity to manage it drops. The solution is not to become someone else or to rewire your brain into a different configuration. It's to build the scaffolding that lets you operate as yourself without collapsing under the weight of everything you see. You're back in the coffee shop where this started. The pen is still tapping against the notebook in that same irregular rhythm. The hum is still pulsing through the ventilation system above your head. Your friend is still talking, and you still notice every sound in the room at once. But now you know what's actually happening underneath the surface. You're not broken, undisciplined, or failing at something everyone else finds easy. You're just built to see too much, and the difference between breakthrough and breakdown is whether you have the capacity to hold it.